Hi, everybody. Welcome to a story that drifts gently through candlelit corridors, behind thick stone walls, and into a world that rarely speaks aloud. Tonight, we're drawing back a curtain, a soft, velvet curtain, on a chapter of history often cloaked in silence, the intimate and unexpected lives of medieval nuns. Our journey begins not with scandal, but with stillness. Before the carnal whispers, there was quiet devotion. Or was there? So, pull your blanket a little closer, let your thoughts settle, and prepare for a tale that wanders through centuries of cloistered life with a curious smile and a very gentle step. Long before our modern assumptions about nuns were shaped by film cliches or tidy Sunday school illustrations, the medieval convent was something far more complex, more human, more contradictory, and much less isolated from the tangled web of worldly affairs than one might think. To truly understand the eventual carnal scandals whispered across parchment and pulpit alike, we need to begin with the setting, with the cloisters, with the silence. Imagine, if you will, a chilly spring morning in 13th century France. The dew is still clinging stubbornly to the ivy creeping up the stone walls of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, a real Benedictine abbey tucked into the folds of the French countryside. Inside, the air smells of beeswax, old stone, and faint incense, N.E., ancient perfume of order and mystery. Here, young women, many not much older than 16, have been brought, or sometimes volunteered, to live out their days in devotion. But devotion, in the medieval context, was not always purely religious. It could also mean obedience to family expectations, escape from poverty, or simply having no other place to go. We imagine nuns in pristine white habits, gliding like ghosts through echoing halls. But in reality, convent life was often bustling, practical, and strangely porous. Yes, the doors were thick, and the prayers daily, but there were also cooks, gardeners, scribes, and sometimes even visiting nobles. Convents were not just spiritual sanctuaries, they were also economic hubs, political pawns, and social mosaics. And not all nuns were there for the same reasons. For aristocratic families, placing a daughter in a convent could serve several purposes. It reduced the number of heirs to manage, avoided expensive marriage dowries, and kept potentially unruly young women tucked safely out of the public eye. But not all these women went quietly or stayed chaste. One of the most telling aspects of this period is the surprising number of surviving records detailing disciplinary issues. Yes, the medieval church kept detailed logs of absconding nuns, inappropriate letters, stolen wine, and yes, instances of what they called carnal failings. But let's not jump ahead just yet. First, we need to understand the daily rhythm of the cloister, for it is in this rhythm that tensions both spiritual and sensual would slowly rise. The Rule of Saint Benedict, a foundational text for many monastic communities, dictated a precise structure of prayer, labor, and silence. The day would begin in darkness with the first service, matins, usually around 2 or 3 a.m. Imagine being roused from a straw mattress, the chill biting your bare feet, trudging down a torch-lit corridor to chant psalms in Latin before the sun had even considered waking. Sleep deprivation was a kind of spiritual discipline. Hunger often was, too. After prayers, the nuns might return to their cells, or go about tasks assigned by the abbess. Some were gardeners, others copyists, others taught young girls from noble families. Meals were taken in silence, and even casual conversation was discouraged outside designated times. The silence was both practical and symbolic. It was a path to humility, a wall against gossip, and in theory, a hedge against temptation. But temptation, as you might guess, is a resourceful creature. Despite the outward serenity, convent life could be intensely emotional. Strong attachments formed between the women, platonic, maternal, spiritual, romantic, or somewhere in the hazy middle. Letters from the time, scribbled in Latin or Old French, speak of spiritual friendship, in tones that sometimes burn a little warmer than expected. Hugs were allowed, kisses on the cheek too. But what of the hand that lingered too long? the late-night confidences behind curtain-parted beds. Even within this highly regimented life, loneliness crept in. And where loneliness dwells, longing is never far behind. Yet the church had its eyes open. Rules against particular friendships existed for a reason. In some convents, nuns were forbidden from spending time alone with the same sister too often, especially in the dormitories. Windows had to be left open. Doors remained ajar. Of course, these very restrictions often heightened the sense of intimacy. What is forbidden, after all, is not necessarily extinguished. As we drift into the next parts of this story, we'll begin to encounter the documented moments, both scandalous and poignant, when the veil slipped. When nuns defied not only the rules of the convent but the expectations of an entire religious order. When the carnal world pushed its way, gently or not, into the sacred. But tonight, as the abbey bells toll softly over the hills, we'll let these thoughts settle. There is time ahead, and secrets waiting to be shared. In the hush of the cloistered world, it was often not thunder that preceded a scandal, but a whisper. Our journey continues within the stone walls of the medieval convent, where silence was a virtue and affection was a risk. Tonight we will slowly unfold the delicate and sometimes dangerous layers of what was called, in ecclesiastical terms, amicitia particularis, particular friendship. To the outsider, this might sound innocent, perhaps even quaint. Two young women walking side by side, exchanging glances during silent meals, or offering each other a wordless smile beneath the candlelight of Vespers. But to the abbesses, the bishops, and the rulebooks of the church, these friendships were a cause for concern, because they so often stirred emotions that threatened the celibate ideal, and sometimes more than just emotions. Let us now imagine a specific place, not in France this time, but in what is now northern Italy, at the Abbey of San Sisto in the late 1200s. It was a community known for its learning and strict discipline. Among its members were women of education and nobility, women with sharp minds and cloistered hearts. One such nun, Sister Angelica of Parma, left behind fragments of letters, only fragments, unfortunately, because the originals were condemned and burned, and we know of them only through inquisitorial records. These fragments mention another nun. "My dove in the garden," she calls her. There is talk of fingers entwined in prayer, lips close enough to share breath, and dreams that return, each night with the same face. No explicit act is named, but then perhaps none needed to be. The term particular friendship was never defined strictly in legal terms, because to define it would be to acknowledge it too clearly. Yet ecclesiastical authorities knew well what they were seeing. They issued repeated warnings against possessive affection, too much closeness of bodily presence, and undue preference. They feared the intimacy that could flower in the absence of men, not because they believed women incapable of love, but precisely because they were. Some convents even instituted rotation policies, ensuring that nuns changed roommates or work partners regularly. In one Benedictine house recorded in 1312, a mother superior imposed a rule that no two nuns were to sit beside each other more than once a week, unless in liturgical necessity. But rules, as we know, do not always suppress longing. They sometimes intensify it. For many of these women, especially those cloistered from a young age, the convent was the entire world. And within that small world, love could take root in places where light barely reached. The daily rhythm of shared tasks, kneading bread together in the early hours, repairing torn hems side by side, whispering psalms into the shadows, became a kind of liturgy of connection. In some recorded cases, the intimacy grew bold. In 1326, the Bishop of Augsburg received a complaint about two nuns at the convent of Heiligkreuz. They were said to share not only a cell, but a bed, and had been seen comforting each other in ways that caused the younger sisters to blush and turn away. The bishop sent an investigator who later wrote, "They cling to each other in both sorrow and laughter and are slow to part even when the bell rings. The language is restrained, the meaning is not." Of course, not all particular friendships were romantic. Many were truly spiritual, deep, affirming, emotionally rich without ever slipping into physicality. These friendships formed the emotional backbone of cloistered life, but the line for some blurred, and when it did, it was rarely easy to draw back. Sometimes these relationships drew envy. One poor novice wrote in a surviving diary scrap, "Sister, Aldegund sits always beside Sister Agnes and whispers to her in a voice like song. I asked to help mend the altar cloths, but was told no. Aldegund must assist. I feel like air. Heartache in the cloister. Jealousy cloaked in habit." In this intense emotional atmosphere, scandal did not require sin, only suspicion. And once suspicion bloomed, it was very hard to prune. Punishments varied. In mild cases, nuns might be assigned penance, extra prayers, solitary meditation, or temporary removal from communal life. In more serious accusations, the women could be reassigned to distant convents or brought before ecclesiastical courts. There were cases, rare but real, where excommunication loomed. In 1335, 2 nuns in Cologne were accused not only of inappropriate intimacy, but of influencing others to form similar attachments. One was eventually returned to her convent with a vow of silence. The other disappeared from all further records. It is worth pausing here to consider. Were these women lovers in the modern sense? Or simply souls starved for affection, reaching across rules to find meaning in each other's gaze? The truth, like so much of history, is probably both. The Church, for all its stern doctrine, was not blind to the humanity within these cloisters. Some confessors wrote letters of astonishing empathy. One, found in a manuscript from 1292, tells a young nun, "If thy heart clings to another as vine to wall, see not only sin, but a soul seeking comfort. But hold thyself as lantern, not as fire." Beautiful, isn't it? A warning, yes, but one laced with gentleness. Tonight we leave these women with their secrets intact. The quiet crushes, the forbidden glances, the long-held hands beneath woolen sleeves. The human heart, even under layers of linen and silence, beats on. And in our next part, we will explore what happened when the world outside began to notice. When kings and bishops and even some wayward lovers crossed the threshold of the convent not with prayer books but with passion. In the early hours before dawn, when most of the convent still lay wrapped in sleep and soft prayer, there were rare moments, quiet intrusions, when the outside world came knocking. And when it did, it rarely knocked gently. Tonight, we step across that threshold. Thus far, we've explored the deep and subtle currents of emotional and spiritual affection within the cloister. But what happens when the source of temptation does not bloom from within, but enters from beyond? When the convent door, meant to keep the world at bay, is opened not by faith, but by power. Let us return now to the 14th century, this time to the Abbey of Fontevraud in France. Founded in the 1100s, Fontevraud was an unusual place. It was a double monastery, housing both monks and nuns under the rule of a powerful abbess. The abbey was richly endowed, often visited by nobles and bishops, and as with all wealthy places, power came with eyes. Curious eyes. It was in such a place that Sister Melisande served. She was a woman of noble birth, quick wit, and striking presence, according to an account preserved in a bishop's complaint. And she caught the attention of a certain Count Raoul of Anjou. Count Raoul had been a benefactor of the abbey. His donations of land and wine were generous. So generous, in fact, that the abbess allowed him to speak occasionally with the sisters, under supervision, of course. But supervision can grow weary, and Count Raoul knew how to make it so. Over time, short conversations turned into longer ones. A dropped glove returned with a compliment. A chaperoned stroll in the herb garden, during which no one heard what passed between them. Until one day, Sister Melisande disappeared. She left behind a note, tucked in her psalter, claiming divine inspiration to seek God elsewhere. It was only months later that a traveling friar returned from Anjou and whispered of a veiled lady living at Raoul's estate. Unwed, but unmistakably cloistered once. What do we make of this? Was it love? Was it coercion masked as chivalry, or was Melisande simply a woman who longed for something the convent could never offer, and saw her moment? Whatever the truth, the scandal rocked Fontevraud. Donations slowed, the abbess imposed new restrictions, and other sisters, emboldened or perhaps merely curious, began to test the edges of obedience. This was not an isolated case. There are accounts from across Europe, England, Spain, Italy, of noblemen visiting convents under the guise of piety, only to leave having planted seeds of disruption. In some cases, the seduction was not personal but political. A bishop's niece placed in the convent as a spy, a king's cousin taking vows solely to secure ecclesiastical lands. And with such motivations came the scent of corruption. One of the more infamous cases occurred in Cologne in 1369, where a group of Dominican friars was found frequenting a neighboring nunnery under the pretense of spiritual counsel. It began, as such things often did, with sermons, then private confession, then poetry, then, eventually, a scandal so widespread it required intervention from Rome. When the papal envoy arrived, he discovered a disorder of such magnitude that the cloister is more tavern than temple. His words, not mine. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. One monk wrote in his journal, "The more the walls grow higher, the more eager men are to peer over them. And yet, not all intrusions came cloaked in lust. Some were genuine attempts at spiritual connection gone awry. A young Franciscan in Bologna, charged with offering spiritual instruction to cloistered novices, found himself enamored with one, Sister Lucia, a gifted singer whose voice moved even the most stoic. His letters to her, preserved in a local archive, begin with theological reflections, then drift slowly into poems. He writes, "If thy soul be a garden, I ask only to sit quietly among thy roses. It is beautiful." It is also the beginning of his removal from office. What all these cases show is that the boundary between the sacred and the sensual was never absolute. The convent, though bounded by stone and rule, remained part of a world pulsing with desire, ambition, and very human curiosity. And in some rare cases, nuns welcomed that world in. Take, for instance, the letters of Sister Agnès de Bourgogne, written in the 1390s. Though deeply religious, she maintained correspondence with several court poets. In one letter, she asks for verses, not too holy, not too harsh, but like warm wine on a winter night. Her abbess scolded her, but the letters continued, tucked carefully into sacks of flour sent from the monastery's bakery to the nearby court. We do not know if these correspondences ever turned physical, but even in their words there is intimacy, gentle, playful, dangerous. Not all nuns were victims of seduction. Some were, in fact, initiators. In 1381, in the city of Ghent, a merchant was fined for unchaste correspondence with a woman of holy orders. His testimony claimed she approached him during his supply deliveries and slipped notes into his hands beneath the turnips. The notes included verses and, somewhat boldly, an invitation to meet under the guise of charity work. She signed herself, "Only Sœur Inconnue, Sister Unknown. Did they ever meet? We do not know. But we know this, she was not found." This pattern of quiet resistance, or perhaps romantic rebellion, shows a persistent truth across the centuries. Even within the strictest walls, the human heart finds its way to wander. Not always with sin, often with longing. As we close tonight's chapter, imagine the abbey at dusk, the stone warm from the fading sun, the bells tolling softly, calling the sisters to Compline. And in some quiet corner, perhaps two eyes meeting across the courtyard, briefly, dangerously, tenderly. In our next part, we will turn to the most infamous scandal of them all, a convent so overrun by desire and intrigue that even the Pope had to intervene. A place where sin wore a habit and prayer sounded suspiciously like laughter. Let us drift now, ever so gently, to a place where the sacred and the scandalous tangled so thoroughly that even the stones of the cloister may have blushed. Tonight we visit the convent of Sant'Ambrogio in 19th century Rome. A slight stretch, forward in time from our medieval theme, yes, but so steeped in old traditions and medieval vestiges that it might as well be wearing a veil from the 13th century. And it is here, amid incense and intrigue, that one of the church's most shocking convent scandals unfolded. So grave, in fact, that it reached the ears of Pope Pius IX himself. But first, picture it. A Baroque convent nestled behind ancient Roman walls, its facade unassuming, its name modest. Within, however, swirled a spiritual storm so laced with lust, manipulation, and forbidden rituals that one papal investigator would later call it a house of masked devotion. At the center of this swirling vortex stood a figure as enigmatic as she was magnetic, Sister Maria Luisa, a woman of intense religious fervor, or so it appeared, and according to multiple testimonies, an unrivaled expert in guiding novices toward holiness. Except that her version of holiness involved, shall we say, unorthodox practices. It began, as many such stories do, with a noblewoman, Princess Katharina von Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a German aristocrat and widow with a deep yearning for purpose, sought a life of piety, and chose Sant Ambrogio as her retreat. She expected silence. She expected austerity. What she found, however, was a convent not of quiet prayer, but of whispered incantations, secret kisses, and something rather more carnal hiding beneath the cassocks. Upon her arrival, Katharina was warmly, perhaps too warmly, welcomed by Sister Maria Luisa. Assigned as her spiritual director, Maria Luisa began to guide the princess through special devotions, many of which alarmed Katharina almost immediately. These included nighttime visits to the princess's cell, scented ointments for divine stimulation, and phrases like the holy union of souls through flesh. Katharina, no naive debutante, quickly grew suspicious. But when she raised concerns, strange things began to happen. She was told in hushed tones that to doubt Maria Luisa was to doubt the Virgin herself. She was discouraged from writing letters. Her food began to taste odd. Her health declined. Her prayers were met with smiles that did not reach the eyes. Sensing real danger and spiritual rot, Katharina finally managed to send a desperate letter to the Vatican. It reached a Cardinal von Rysach, who, intrigued and disturbed, ordered an immediate and secret investigation. And what the investigation uncovered was far more than anyone expected. Testimonies from other nuns revealed that Maria Luisa had orchestrated a cult-like following within the convent. She claimed mystical visions, claimed Jesus visited her bodily, and insisted that certain ritual caresses were necessary acts of divine cleansing. She distributed small wafers, mock sacraments, during these ceremonies, which took place behind closed doors in candlelit cells. Some sisters confessed they were coerced. Others admitted to participation willingly, seduced by Maria Luisa's charisma and threats of damnation. One wrote, "Her voice was as sweet as honey, and her threats burned as hellfire. I did not know which I feared more." And the poisoning? Yes. Investigators found that certain herbs, used in doses just below lethal, were added to the food of dissenting nuns. Katharina had not imagined it. She had narrowly escaped death. The scandal broke quietly at first. The Vatican, ever cautious, sought to handle the matter with discretion. Maria Luisa was removed, questioned, and eventually condemned not for her more lurid acts, but for false mysticism and abuse of influence. The convent was reformed, which in church language means thoroughly cleansed, and placed under new leadership. But word spread nonetheless. For many within the church, it was a bitter embarrassment, proof that not even cloistered walls could fully contain the dangers of unchecked power, spiritual manipulation, and repressed desire. For others, it was a warning that when the natural needs of the body are demonized without understanding, they do not vanish. They fester. And yet, even in this tale, there is space for sympathy. One cannot help but wonder, who was Maria Luisa? Before the veil? A woman desperate to matter? A soul who mistook obsession for devotion? Or perhaps someone who tasted power once and could not bear to lose it? We may never know. But what we do know is that Sant'Ambrogio was not alone. Across Europe, whispers of similar occurrences, albeit less dramatic, had been recorded for centuries. This was simply the case that came too close to royalty, too close to Rome, and too far from silence. As the bells toll softly tonight, let us step gently away from Sant'Ambrogio, leaving behind its heavy air and haunted dormitories. The nuns, who once laughed behind those walls, who chanted by day and sinned by night, are long gone. Only the marble remembers. In the next part of our story, we will look not at a single scandal, but at a broader pattern. How convents became, for some women, both prisons and places of secret empowerment. A strange contradiction where submission bred rebellion and the veil became both shield and sword. The night quiets and the wind rustles gently through imagined trees beyond cloister walls. It is in this soft silence that we consider a curious truth. For many medieval women, the convent was both a cage and a cradle. A prison, but also a path to power. In the heart of medieval Christendom, options for women were, shall we say, limited. They could marry, they could serve, or they could vanish behind stone and silence, taking the veil as both a burden and, sometimes, a banner. Tonight, we drift slowly into this duality, where obedience coexisted with quiet defiance and where the cloister, ironically, sometimes offered more freedom than the world outside. Let us begin in Burgundy, in the early 12th century. Here stood the Abbey of Fontevraud once more, a place we briefly visited earlier. Unlike most monastic communities, Fontevraud was ruled by an abbess, and not just any abbess, but one with authority over both monks and nuns. Her word was law, her governance, unquestioned. For many male clergy, this was uncomfortable, and for good reason. Abbess Petronilla, for instance, held audiences with dukes, managed vineyards, and maintained correspondence with bishops on matters theological and political. She did all this while technically being a bride of Christ, cloistered and celibate. But behind the convent walls, she governed like a queen, and she was not alone. Across Europe, records show abbesses wielding influence not unlike feudal lords. They settled disputes, managed lands, administered schools, and, in some rare cases, excommunicated local priests for insubordination. All this from within the very walls meant to keep them subdued. But how could this be? The answer lies partly in property. Many women entered convents with dowries. Nobles endowed convents with estates, fields, and serfs. Managing these assets required skill and autonomy. The church, needing the revenue, allowed it. And so, by necessity, spiritual power began to blend with economic authority. And with that came influence. But influence is not freedom. Not entirely. Most nuns lived under strict obedience. 3 vows, remember: poverty, chastity, and submission. And yet, within those vows, there was room to breathe. Some nuns became scribes, chronicling history from a woman's perspective. Others composed music, like Hildegard of Bingen, whose chants still echo today. And others wrote letters. Long, clever, eloquent letters that often walked the line between piety and protest. Sister Beatrice of Dijon, writing in the 13th century, composed a letter to her brother, a monk, in which she lamented the endless washing of altar linens and the lack of books. "You pray with parchments," she wrote. "I scrub with vinegar. But we both worship, do we not?" Her words are sharp, humorous, and undeniably aware. These quiet protests were not always so quiet. In 1288, in a convent near Seville, a group of nuns refused to obey a newly appointed abbess. They barred her from entering the convent, citing her worldly inclinations and rumored affair with a visiting friar. They locked the gates. They rang the bells in reverse. And for nearly 3 weeks, they ran the convent themselves, petitioning the bishop to send someone else. Eventually, the church relented. It was rebellion, but with incense. In some cases, empowerment came not through defiance, but creativity. Illuminated manuscripts, those gorgeous gilded texts with tiny flowers and birds painted in the margins, were often made in convents. And some of those decorations, when studied closely, reveal sly humor and unexpected wit. A 14th century book of hours from Bruges, likely painted by a nun named Claire, includes a scene of a nun chasing a fox with a frying pan. What does it mean? Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps Claire was poking gentle fun at her abbess. Or perhaps she simply needed to laugh. Humor, after all, was another kind of power. Even rules could be turned into tools. Take the vow of chastity. On its surface, it was a limitation. But for many women, it meant freedom from childbirth, marital obligation, and male dominance. Inside the convent, their bodies belonged, at least theoretically, only to God. And in a world where women's lives were often defined by the men around them, this was, ironically, a kind of liberation. The veil was not always a shroud. Sometimes, it was a mask behind which a woman could read, write, lead, or think freely in a way society would otherwise forbid. And yet, this fragile freedom came at a cost. If a nun stepped too far outside her bounds, if her influence grew too bold or her voice too loud, she could be punished, reassigned, silenced. The church gave power, but only so much. The line was always, "They are thin as a reed, sharp as a knife, still the stories endure." Stories of women who found a way, through prayer, through parchment, through persistence, to shape their own destinies inside a world that had written them off. One final image before we end tonight's chapter. In the late 1200s, in the convent of Santa Clara in Valencia, a nun named Isabel was known for her reluctance to conform. She refused to eat fish on Fridays, claiming divine exemption. She wore her veil slightly askew, so that a lock of hair, her last vanity she called it, could peek out. And when asked why she walked barefoot in the winter, she replied, "Because even the cold must kneel before my will." She was not expelled, not punished. In fact, her sisters loved her, and after her death, they preserved her sandals. They rest today in a small museum, worn at the toes, laced with quiet defiance. In our next chapter, we return to the shadows, not of power but of punishment. We will explore how the church sought to discipline what it could not fully contain, and the strange rituals of penance, exile, and reconsecration that awaited those who strayed. The candles burn low tonight. Their light flickers against stone walls, casting long shadows in places where laughter once stirred and secrets were whispered. But this chapter is quieter. It is the silence that follows scandal, the stillness of repentance, or perhaps something far colder. Tonight, we drift into the world of punishment, how the church responded when nuns strayed from their vows, when devotion slipped into desire, and when cloistered walls no longer held back the tides of temptation. Let us begin not with a name, but with a ritual. In a manuscript from 13th century England, carefully preserved in the archives of Hereford Cathedral, there exists a document titled De Disciplina Monialium Peccatricium, or On the Discipline of Our Sinful Nuns. It details in soft Latin and with heavy formality what was to be done when a nun committed what the church called grave violations. These included carnal acts, contact with outsiders, heretical speech, and defiance of superiors. The punishments were not designed simply to correct. They were meant to humble, to purify, to make visible the internal shame that sin was thought to cause. Picture this: a small chapel at dawn. The community gathered. At the front, the abbess, calm, austere, robed in authority, and beside her, a kneeling figure, a sister stripped not of all clothing but of dignity. Her hair may have been cut short, her face veiled in linen, her hands tied with a simple rope of penance. The ritual would begin with scripture. Then came the recitation of the sin, spoken aloud, sometimes by the sinner herself. A form of public confession, but not to seek forgiveness from God alone. No, this was a performance of shame before the entire convent. Then the sentence. Sometimes it was silence, a month, 2 months, even a year, during which the offending nun would eat apart from the others, sleep alone in a cold cell and be barred from communion. In some cases, she would wear a special color, often gray or brown, marking her as a penitent. In others, a wooden plaque with a single word carved into it: luxuria, lust. There were harsher punishments too. Some nuns were confined to their cells entirely, allowed only bread, water, and the Psalms. Others were forced to fast on holy days until they fainted. There is a record from 1347 of a nun in Liège who was locked in a small chapel for 40 days with only a crucifix, a cot, and a copy of the Rule of St. Benedict. She survived, but her letters afterward were filled with silence. Half-finished sentences, words that trailed off like breath lost in winter. These were not just punishments. They were rituals of erasure. But some nuns resisted even in penance. One, Sister Avelina of Troyes, accused of maintaining a clandestine relationship with a local apothecary, was sentenced to a year of isolation. Her only request? That she be allowed to keep her ink and parchment. The abbess agreed. Over the next 12 months, Avelina wrote, not just psalms, but stories, poems. One allegory survives, hidden in the margins of a liturgical book, a tale of a bird caged in a stone tower who sings until the tower cracks. Was it repentance or resistance? Sometimes the punishments were far more theatrical. In Spain in the early 1400s, the Inquisition began to reach into convents. Accusations of heresy, real or imagined, meant that nuns were not just judged by their abbesses but by male inquisitors from outside. The trials were formal, the language brutal. Some nuns were branded witches. Others were accused of demonic possession, especially if their carnal acts involved dreams or visions. One such woman, Sister Feliciana of Cordoba, claimed in ecstasy that the Archangel Michael had kissed her lips. She described warmth, light, and divine trembling. Her confession turned quickly into condemnation. She was flogged, reconsecrated in a public mass, and forbidden to speak without permission for 2 years. But even here, the church walked a line. They did not wish to destroy the image of purity they had so carefully cultivated around the convent, and so many punishments were kept secret. Records were coded. Nuns were transferred quietly. In some cases, the offending sisters simply vanished from the rolls, replaced by silence, and yet some returned. After years of penance, some nuns were allowed back into the fold, washed, reveiled, reanointed. One ritual recorded in Florence in 1372 involved a sister re-entering the convent barefoot, carrying her veil in both hands, which was then placed upon her head by the abbess. The other nuns sang a modified chant, not the joyous tones of Easter, but something softer, slower. A lamentation turned gentle welcome. It is easy, perhaps, to judge these rituals from the safety of modernity. But let us pause. Let us look with gentler eyes. For many of these women, the convent was their world, their family, their society. To be exiled, even temporarily, was not just punishment, it was a kind of death. A removal from warmth, from rhythm, from identity, and to return was resurrection. Of course, not all returned. Some remained in isolation. Others left the convent entirely, stripped of vows and status, their futures uncertain. And a few disappeared from record, leaving only faded names in the margins of old ledgers, where ink has outlived memory. But even in the face of punishment, the carnal spirit of humanity proved stubborn. It flickered, it flared, and sometimes it simply waited. In the next part of our story, we will move from penance to pleasure once more, this time examining how food, music, and forbidden texts became subtle conduits for desire in cloistered life. A gentler rebellion, perhaps, but no less daring. Not all rebellions wear boots. Some come in spoons, in parchment, in soft melodies hummed too sweetly for mere worship. Tonight we slip into the quieter corners of the medieval convent, not those where scandal burned like wildfire, but where it simmered like slow honey over low heat. These are the stories of gentle indulgence, of food too rich, music too sensual, and books just a touch too dangerous. Let us begin, perhaps unexpectedly, with cheese. Yes, cheese. In the Benedictine rule, the same monastic code followed by thousands of nuns across Europe, there were detailed regulations about fasting and food. Meat was limited, spices discouraged, meals taken in silence. But even so, the kitchens of many convents hummed with a kind of sacred mischief. At the Abbey of Jouarre, in 12th century France, the cellarer's ledger survives. It includes line items for almond milk prepared with rosewater, honeyed bread for feast days, and, curiously, soft cheeses sent only to the upper dormitory. Why only the upper dormitory? One scribe, in the margin of that same ledger, scribbled the phrase, "For the sisters who dream too much." What does that mean? Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps it was a joke among the kitchen staff, referring to the older, more introspective nuns. Or perhaps those upstairs were allowed just a little more, a little creamier, sweeter comfort, a small pleasure in a life of denial. And food was not the only indulgence. In many convents, music was not merely allowed, it was encouraged. Chanting was central to daily prayer. But beyond the formalities of the divine office, there were songs, and some strayed. One remarkable example comes from the convent of Las Huelgas in Spain, which housed noblewomen and boasted an unusually rich musical tradition. In a surviving 14th century songbook, there's a piece titled Virgo de Genitrix. On the surface, a Marian hymn, but musicologists have noted its rhythm and tonality more closely resemble a courtly love song than a chant. The melody sways. It yearns. The harmonies ache just slightly, like a heart leaning towards something it knows it cannot have. Who composed it? Perhaps a visiting monk, or perhaps a nun with a memory of music from her childhood, of dances she never danced, of ballads her nursemaids once sang, and then there were the books. The church was wary of fiction, particularly stories of romance, but manuscripts had a way of slipping past censors. A list from a 15th century English convent includes a mysterious volume titled De Amore et Castitate, translated On Love and Chastity. Sounds innocent, doesn't it? But upon closer examination, scholars found it contained not only pious advice, but excerpts from the Roman poet Ovid, especially The Art of Love. Even more telling is the marginalia, the tiny handwritten notes scribbled in the margins by the readers. One nun, reading a passage about stolen kisses, added, "Would God frown upon lips that tremble?" Another drew a tiny heart beside a particularly heated verse. She outlined it in red ink, then added wings. These were not acts of full rebellion, but they were little escapes, moments of self within a life meant to be entirely selfless. And yet none of these pleasures necessarily contradicted faith. Rather, they coexisted with it. A slice of honeyed fig on the feast of St. Agatha, a warm roll hidden beneath a napkin for a sickly novice, a harp chord played too slowly, too sweetly, after Compline. In these moments, the convent was not a fortress but a hearth, and many abbesses knew. Of course they knew. There is a letter from Abbess Clarissa of Bologna, written in the 1320s, where she gently chides a young nun for spending too long near the ovens and too little near the psalms. But then she adds, "Yet if the Lord created sweetness, shall we not taste it with prayer?" Not all discipline is stern. Some smiles are part of the rule. There are also records of convent feast days, where the usual austerity relaxed. Dances, slow and solemn, were sometimes permitted. Jests were shared. Even small performances took place, often with humorous religious themes. These were safe releases, a way to laugh without sinning, to enjoy without falling, but not everyone was content with sweet crumbs. There are hints in records, subtle, often veiled, of pleasures that crossed lines. Nuns caught with contraband spices, secret stills used to make cordial, a cloistered sister in Avignon who smuggled in preserved fruits from her family estate, distributing them like treasure. Was it gluttony? Perhaps. Or perhaps, simply hunger, in all its forms. Desire, as it turns out, wears many veils. One final image before we end tonight's chapter: a small convent in Provence, 14th century. It is spring. A nun, young, clever, called Julienne, is found in the garden after vespers, sitting beneath the fig tree. She is not praying. She is humming a melody no one else recognizes, slow and low, eyes half closed. The abbess approaches, stands silently. Julienne does not stop humming, and then softly the abbess joins in. A second voice, steady, older. Together, they sing a tune forgotten by the world, but not by them. A song not written in any prayer book. In our next part, we will follow the trail of forbidden love beyond the cloister, when nuns escape not only rules but walls themselves. Stories of flight, disguise, and the mad pursuit of life beyond the veil. Not all who wore the veil kept it. Not all who entered the cloister stayed. And not all who vowed chastity remained untouched by the world. Tonight we follow a quieter kind of revolution. A slippered step in the night, a bundle hidden beneath, a habit, a gate left ajar. These are the stories of the runaways. Nuns who broke the ultimate vow, not through a secret kiss or sweet indulgence, but by walking away entirely. Let us begin in Florence. It was 1472. The convent of Santa Verdiana stood near the banks of the Arno, respectable, quiet, known for its strict discipline and fine embroidery. But one morning a novice named Isabetta was gone. No signs of struggle. Her bed neat, her psalter open at the evening psalm. Only her veil was missing, along with one cloak and a pair of well-made shoes. The abbess was outraged. A citywide search was launched. And when Isabetta was finally found 2 days later, she was wearing a green gown and singing in a roadside inn. Was she ashamed? Not in the least. Records say she smiled. Said she had felt called by music more than God. The bishop had returned, of course. But 6 months later she vanished again, this time for good. Florence was hardly alone in its rebellious sisters. Across Europe, from the Low Countries to the Iberian Peninsula, court records, convent chronicles, and inquisitorial files contain one phrase that repeats with startling regularity: monialis fugitiva, a runaway nun. The motivations were varied. Some ran for love, like Sister Caterina of Lucca, who slipped out in the dead of night to follow a merchant's son she had seen only once, through the grill of the guest chapel. They exchanged poems. He passed them folded inside figs. She answered on scraps of altar cloth. Others fled from abuse or despair, or simply because they had never chosen the veil to begin with. In many cases, girls were placed in convents as children, age 7, 8, 10, not old enough to understand the vow, only to repeat it. And when they reached 15, 16, their bodies awakening, their minds flowering, some could no longer bear it. There are testimonies that bring tears even today. A nun from Krakow, anonymous in record, was found at a traveler's hospice after escaping her convent barefoot. She told the chaplain, "I never wanted the silence. I wanted books. I wanted laughter. I wanted to speak loudly, at least once." And so she did. Of course, the church did not look kindly on flight. A nun who fled her vows was not simply disobedient. She was perjured, a kind of spiritual traitor. Some were excommunicated. Others were returned forcibly. In extreme cases, they were confined in isolation or transferred to stricter houses. But the law, too, had its cracks. In the 14th century, a legal scholar in Paris wrote an odd little treatise titled De Penitentia Fugientium, on the penance of those who flee. He argued, gently but firmly, that a nun who had taken vows under coercion might not be fully bound. His words found little favor at first, but over time, his argument gained traction. By the late 1400s, some dioceses began investigating whether a nun's vows had been freely chosen before punishing her for fleeing, a small mercy perhaps, but a meaningful one. There were dramatic escapes too. One of the most famous involved a Spanish nun, Sister Eulalia of Burgos, who faked a vision, convinced her abbess that she was called to pilgrimage, and left the convent on a white mule. She wandered for months, visiting churches and cities, writing poetry under a false name. She was eventually caught, not by clerics, but by a jealous suitor she had abandoned. Her punishment: she was locked in a cell for 2 years with only religious texts, a jug of water, and a loaf of bread per day. She emerged thinner, quieter, but reportedly with 3 new sonnets memorized by heart. Some nuns disguised themselves. In Prague, a sister once dressed as a man joined a traveling troupe of players and acted in comedies for over a year before being discovered. Her former convent, upon learning her identity, refused to take her back. Her laughter, the abbess wrote, has broken the rule more than her legs ever did. Not all stories ended sadly. A few runaways found new lives. Some married, others joined different orders. A handful even wrote memoirs, though most are lost or buried under ecclesiastical edicts. What is certain, however, is that the urge to flee was never just rebellion. It was often resurrection, a reaching toward life not denied, but chosen. One final story tonight. In a small village near Ghent, a nun named Alette vanished in 1428. The sisters searched, prayed, feared the worst. But months later, they received a letter. It read, "I wake now to birdsong I choose. I pray not by rule, but by rhythm. I do not curse the cloister, but I love this air. If this is sin, let it be a soft one." No one ever came for her. In our next part, we will visit a stranger phenomenon: the mystical visions of nuns, some divine, some delirious, and a few unmistakably erotic. What happens when the sacred turns sensuous and saints appear not with fire, but with longing? There is a silence that is not empty, but full of breath held, of eyes closed, of a soul waiting to be touched by something vast, something beyond the veil of this world. And in the candlelit cloisters of the medieval convent, many women waited. Some saw tonight. We step gently into the realm of the mystical. Visions, ecstasies, and dreams that blurred the boundary between the divine and the deeply, deeply human. Let us begin with a name whispered even now: Saint Teresa of Avila. Though she lived in the 16th century, her legacy ripples backward through time, shaping how we understand a very particular kind of holy encounter. In her writings, Teresa described spiritual rapture in startlingly vivid terms. "He pierced my heart with a spear of gold, and left me wholly inflamed with the love of God." So intense was her language, so rich in physical sensation, that artists through the centuries have painted her not in prayerful serenity, but in trembling ecstasy, lips parted, eyes rolled heavenward. The sacred, it seems, does not always arrive quietly, but Saint Teresa was not alone. Long before her, medieval nuns were recording their own encounters. Dreams, trances, and apparitions filled their journals and testimonies. Sometimes these were strictly religious, visions of Christ, of Mary, of angels, but often they were far more intimate. Take Hadewig of Brabant, a 13th century beguine whose mystical poetry survives in Old Dutch and Latin. In one poem she writes, "He came to me as fire, as breath. I melted in him, and he in me. My limbs forgot their name. My soul became his kiss." Was this merely metaphor, or something more? The Church struggled with such language. On one hand, it echoed Scripture's own sensuality. Think of the Song of Songs, with its talk of kisses and breasts, and longing. But when women, cloistered women, spoke of such things with their own breath and ink, concern followed. Some confessors cautioned against overheating the imagination. Others accused these women of false visions or even possession. Few were declared heretics, but not always. In certain cases, these experiences were not only accepted, they were celebrated. Mechthild of Magdeburg, another 13th century mystic, wrote a 7-volume text titled The Flowing Light of the Godhead, filled with visions of divine embrace. She described being lifted by the Spirit into the bedchamber of love, where Christ kissed her with the sweetness of eternal fire. Again and again her writings returned to themes of touch, warmth, and surrender. Was this sin or sanctity? Mechthild would argue the latter. She insisted her love was spiritual, but she used the only language she knew. A woman in the Middle Ages had no access to the academic theology of her male counterparts. Her vocabulary came from the body, from longing, from the senses. And what other frame did she have for divine union but that of human intimacy? Many scholars now believe that for cloistered women, visions became a kind of outlet, both spiritually and psychologically. In a life where touch was forbidden, expression monitored, and even speech limited, the mystic trance was a release, a space in which the soul could weep, cry out, or collapse in joy, sometimes literally. Records from the convent of Sant'Orsola in 14th century Italy speak of a nun who fell into ecstatic seizures during prayer. Her body trembled. Her eyes fluttered. She moaned. She spoke in languages unknown. The other nuns were terrified. The abbess, uncertain whether to call an exorcist or a notary, eventually summoned both. The bishop, upon reading the testimony, declared it a blessed burden from the Lord, and she was left to her tremors. But not all such stories ended safely. Some nuns, overwhelmed by these visions, began to speak prophecies. They declared new rules, new gospels, even new paths to salvation. One, in Normandy, insisted that Christ had visited her every night for a week and anointed her, his bride in flesh, not just spirit. She was quietly removed. Her writings burned. And yet, even in these excesses, there is something deeply human. A woman, isolated, seeking love, not physical love, not carnal in the worldly sense, but love that sees, that holds, that understands. For many of these mystics, their language was not erotic in intent, but it revealed what happens when the soul is stretched too long between heaven and earth. One might also ask, why were these visions so often feminine? Perhaps because women in cloisters spent long hours in meditation, in silence, in sensory deprivation. Perhaps because their emotions, unspoken by day, rose at night like incense, sweet and overwhelming. Or perhaps simply because the heart must find its metaphor somewhere, and when the only touch allowed is in dreams, the dreams learn to touch back. One last image tonight. A convent in the Rhineland, 1279. A young novice named Clara is found in the chapel just before dawn, lying before the altar, hands clasped tightly. She is weeping. When asked what she saw, she says, "He came to me. He said nothing, but I knew him. I knew his arms, and I was not afraid." She never spoke of it again. In our next part, we will explore how the wider world responded to these women, how the church, kings, and even poets reacted to the idea of nuns as mystics, lovers, rebels, and saints. Outside the convent walls, the world did not sleep. Kings marched, cities rose, poets rhymed, and bishops debated. And while cloistered nuns lived seemingly removed from these currents, they were never truly invisible. No, they were seen, sometimes admired, sometimes feared, sometimes manipulated. And in tonight's tale, we open the heavy doors just enough to let in the world's gaze. Let us begin in Paris. In the early 14th century, the poet Guillaume de Machaut, one of the most celebrated composers and writers of his day, penned a curious verse about a cloistered woman. She sings behind stone. Her voice is a swan unseen, yet I drown gladly. It was no love song, officially, but the subject is unmistakably a nun, and Machaut was not alone. Throughout medieval Europe, the figure of the nun appeared again and again in literature, not merely as a religious woman, but as symbol. She was mystery, she was purity, she was the unreachable flame, and poets loved to chase fire. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer's Prioress in the Canterbury Tales is a soft parody, dainty, elegant, more concerned with manners than with poverty. Her brooch engraved not with a holy image, but the phrase, Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. Was Chaucer mocking her, or simply showing how the ideal of the nun had become tangled with romantic fantasy? The church, too, was watching. When mystic nuns spoke of visions, the hierarchy responded with cautious curiosity. Some were investigated, others were embraced. If a woman's visions aligned with doctrine, she could be celebrated, canonized even. But if her revelation stepped outside the bounds even slightly, she was silenced. It was a narrow tightrope. Consider Bridget of Sweden, a 14th century noblewoman turned nun whose visions of Christ, rich with blood, tears, and apocalyptic warnings, were eventually approved by the Pope. Her writings were copied across Europe, her image sanctified, but behind her sainthood lay decades of scrutiny. Every word, every symbol in her dreams was weighed, tested, judged. Not every visionary passed. One nun in Poland, claiming to receive nightly visits from the Virgin Mary, was beloved by her local community. But when she claimed that Mary spoke, in the voice of a mother, a sister, and once of a lover, ecclesiastical officials intervened. She was quietly relocated. Her convent's doors were closed for retraining. There were others who wielded attention as power. Abbesses of wealthy houses, particularly in France and Germany, often maintained correspondence with popes and monarchs. Their letters were political, theological, and occasionally poetic. Some even composed treatises or theological commentaries. Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most brilliant minds of the 12th century, combined visions, science, music, and philosophy in her work. She corresponded with emperors. She scolded archbishops. She wrote hymns that still echo in modern choirs, but even she had to fight for her voice. When she buried an excommunicated man on abbey grounds, believing he had repented, the church denied her convent access to the sacraments for months. She stood her ground. She wrote letter after letter, and in the end, she prevailed. The world saw her, and eventually, it listened. Yet not all attention was welcome. In some cases, the fame of a nun brought unwanted visitors, wealthy patrons who insisted on spiritual counsel, poets who sent gifts cloaked in metaphor, even kings. In 1421, a convent in Bruges reported a series of uninvited guests, young nobles who wished to speak with the singing sisters, whose voices had become known beyond the cloister. The abbess refused them entry. But days later, bouquets appeared at the gate, along with notes, rhymed, respectful, yet unmistakably romantic. Was it admiration, infatuation, or simply the age-old habit of men seeking to claim what they cannot reach? There's one account, half myth perhaps, of a Spanish duke who fell so deeply in love with a cloistered nun that he built a second chapel on his estate in her honor. He attended daily mass in her name, sent prayers, donations. Eventually, he died unmarried and was buried with a copy of her letter which read only, "My heart remains veiled." And then, there was gossip. For every sainted nun, there were whispers of others, too beautiful, too free with words, too affectionate with other sisters. City gossip often painted convents as either heavenly havens or dens of suppressed desire. In truth, they were neither. Or rather, both. And poets kept writing. In 15th century Italy, the Lauda tradition, devotional songs sung in the vernacular, often included verses about nuns whose voices healed the sick, whose prayers changed the weather, whose hands glowed during communion. Were these literal miracles, or the flowering of popular imagination? Sometimes even the line between art and reality blurred. There is a surviving stage play, La Monaca Innamorata, The Nun in Love, performed in Venice in the late 1400s. A comedy. The nun escapes, finds love, wears a red ribbon. The audience laughed, cheered, and then, on Sunday, went to Mass. In the eyes of the world, the nun became more than a woman. She was symbol, ideal, warning, dream. But in the cloister, she remained herself, a body wrapped in wool and prayer, with a mind full of contradictions. In our next part, we shall descend more deeply into the contradictions of the flesh. We will explore the confessional, where sin is whispered, forgiveness granted, and sometimes desire awakened. There is a hush in the chapel that is different from all other silences. It is not the stillness of sleep nor the quiet of prayer. It is the pause between sin and salvation, the moment when one heart opens and another listens. Tonight, we enter the confessional, a narrow space, wooden panels, a small screen. One voice speaks, another answers. The words are low, the air close. And in the medieval convent, this ritual was more than absolution. It was intimacy, the only kind some nuns would ever know. Let us begin in Milan around the year 1320. Sister Benedetta, a Franciscan nun, was known for her gentle singing and sharp mind. She had been in the convent since childhood, placed there by her uncle, a merchant. Her days passed in rhythm, prayer, labor, psalms, silence. But once a week, she entered the confessional. Her confessor was Father Marco, older, quiet, educated in Paris. He took his duties seriously. But over time, something shifted. First, Sister Benedetta confessed small things, impatience, daydreaming, a forgotten prayer. But then her voice began to tremble. She spoke of longing, of envy, of a dream in which a man's hand reached through the veil of sleep. She begged forgiveness. He offered it. And then he asked her to describe the dream again. It's easy to see where this is going. But at the time, it would have been unthinkable. Confession was sacred. A priest was a vessel for grace, not desire. And yet, across convents, records show that the confessional became a site not only of spiritual release, but emotional vulnerability. And vulnerability, when met with compassion, can become something else entirely. Sometimes the priest crossed the line, sometimes the nun did. Sometimes both. There is a case from Rouen, in which a Dominican confessor, Father Etienne, was discovered to have written letters to a nun whose sins he had once listened to in great detail. In one surviving fragment he wrote, "Your voice, through the screen, was like a wind in summer. You spoke of guilt, but I felt none." The bishop exiled him to a remote parish. The nun was reassigned. The matter was never spoken of again. But let's not jump to scandal too quickly. In many cases, the confessional was a lifeline, a place where cloistered women, forbidden most forms of self-expression, could finally speak. Their fears, their regrets, their memories. For some, it was the only time anyone asked them, "What burdens your soul?" And yet, that very closeness made the space dangerous. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 made confession mandatory for all Christians at least once a year. For nuns, it became more frequent, in some convents once a week, in others daily during Lent. The priest was often the only man permitted any access to the sisters, albeit separated by a grill or curtain, but even those barriers couldn't always hold back emotion. One abbess, in a letter from 1353, wrote, "I have changed confessors for 3 sisters this month, not for misconduct, but because they wept too long afterward." What were those tears? Relief? Guilt? Or perhaps something more complex, a grief for the closeness that must end when the door creaks open again? Sometimes the confessional became a stage. One confessor in Valencia complained that a novice repeatedly confessed fanciful sins, including lustful thoughts she claimed to have about angels. He suspected she was testing him, or perhaps teasing. There is a curious Latin term used in some ecclesiastical commentaries, tentatio aurium, the temptation of the ears. It referred not to physical touch, but to listening that lingers too long. A sin not of flesh, but of sympathy. Can one fall in love with a voice? Sister Clara of Dijon wrote in her personal prayer book, "I imagine heaven sounds like his whisper." She meant her confessor. Her margins are filled with poems, gentle, devotional, full of longing not quite named, but let us not forget the rules. If any physical contact occurred, it was grave. Confessors could be defrocked, nuns excommunicated. In some cases, penance was brutal. There are accounts of a nun in Mainz forced to wear chains during prayer for an entire year after being found in carnal closeness with her confessor. And yet, such extremes were rare. More often, these were moments of emotional confusion, of kindness mistaken for affection, of pain mistaken for connection, and there were those who used confession for manipulation. One friar in Ghent convinced 3 young nuns that their repeated dreams of divine fire were signs that they needed purification through embrace. He was caught, tried, and sentenced to a life of silence in a rural monastery. The nuns were sent to other convents, their names changed. But for every tale of corruption, there is one of strange, bittersweet mercy. A confessor in Lyon once allowed a nun to confess not in words but through writing. She left her parchment in the box each week. He read it, prayed, wrote 1 sentence in return. This went on for years. No sin serious, no boundary crossed. And when he died, she kept the last note. Your heart is known to God, and to me only gently. One final breath before we end tonight. A chapel, a carved screen, a girl kneeling, her veil slightly askew, her voice low, her secrets bare. And behind the panel, someone listening, not with judgment, but with ache. Because even grace, when heard too closely, can wound. In our next part, we step away from shadow into satire. We will explore how some medieval writers, monks, and mischief makers poked fun at nuns, painting them in bawdy tales and comic stories, sometimes to mock, sometimes to reveal, and sometimes just to laugh. Not all stories of nuns are whispered behind closed doors. Some are shouted from market stalls, scribbled in margins, or acted out with wooden puppets for crowds clutching roasted chestnuts. Tonight, we laugh, because even in the austere world of the Middle Ages, where sin and salvation danced close together, there was always room for satire. And nuns, those cloistered figures of supposed purity, were a favorite target. Let's begin in 13th century France, where a traveling minstrel, known as Jehan le Marchand, composed a series of songs about a fictional convent called Sainte Marguerite de Mirage. In these tunes, the nuns are more interested in wine than worship, and the abbess runs a secret still beneath the chapel. One verse goes, "She rang the bell for vespers, but the sisters were all supine, not with prayer or penance, but from drinking apple wine." Harmless fun? Perhaps. But it reveals something more. The idea of the naughty nun became a stock character in medieval comedy, not because people genuinely believed all nuns were sinful, but because they were supposed to be the opposite. And comedy, as always, loves a contradiction. There's a manuscript from the Low Countries containing a comic tale titled The Veil and the Villager. In it, a young farmer's wife fakes piety and sneaks into a convent to enjoy better food and avoid chores. She's mistaken for a new novice, becomes everyone's favorite, but eventually gives herself away by loudly snoring during matins. The moral? Even under a veil, you can't fake virtue. Or at least, not forever. Medieval plays often picked up on this theme. In Italy, the commedia sacra, religious drama performed in public squares, sometimes included a character known simply as La Monica, the nun. She was clever, flirtatious, always scheming to sneak out of the convent or steal wine. Her character was often paired with a bumbling priest or overly strict abbess, resulting in comedic chaos. One scene from a surviving script has La Monica pretending to be possessed just to avoid kitchen duty. Abbess, do you tremble with divine ecstasy? La Monica, no, just the thought of boiling turnips again. Crowds roared, and actors repeated the joke for decades. Literature, too, indulged in this satire. Perhaps most famously, Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the 14th century contains several stories about nuns behaving less than saintly. In one tale, a nun named Isabetta is caught by the abbess in bed with her lover. But the abbess, herself flustered and disheveled, is wearing a man's trousers on her head. Caught in mutual guilt, they agree to say nothing. The humor is bawdy, yes, but it's also revealing. These stories poke fun not only at the characters but at the structures around them. The strictness, the repression, the absurdity of a system that expected perfect chastity from human beings with very human appetites. Even monks got in on the joke. There are letters and verses written by monastic scribes that tease nearby convents. One Irish monk wrote, "The Sisters of St. Bridget pray with passion, especially when the handsome friars pass in procession. It was meant in jest, but it also hints at the blurry lines between humor and truth." One might ask, did real nuns laugh at these jokes? We'll never know for certain. But some manuscripts from convents contain marginal doodles, playful nuns riding fish, chasing rabbits, even fencing with oversized quills. One book from a German abbey has a note in the corner. If Sister Agnes finds this, she will scold, but perhaps she will smile. And in one remarkable case, we find evidence that nuns were in on the act. In a convent in Catalonia, a play was discovered written in the hand of a nun, La Novicia Rebelde. It's a short comedy about a novice who pretends to be mute to avoid confession, then fakes visions to get better food. The last line? I vowed silence until dessert. It's unclear if it was ever performed, but it tells us this. Not all nuns were humorless. Some, perhaps many, had sharp wit and sharper quills. The bawdy nun, the drunken abbess, the love-struck novice, these were caricatures, but they served a purpose. They offered a release. They let ordinary people, who feared God, who struggled with sin, laugh at the very systems that claimed to hold all virtue. And perhaps they made the nuns more human, because behind the laughter is a truth the medieval world understood all too well, that no one is purely pious, that behind every veil is a woman, and behind every rule, a loophole. One final chuckle for tonight. Doy. A collection of jokes attributed to clerics in 15th century England. There is this. Why did the nun carry a ladder to chapel? To reach higher virtues or the kitchen window. The laughter fades, the candle flickers, and tomorrow we return to quieter things. In the next part, we will descend again into the hidden world, into the libraries of the cloister, where forbidden knowledge was sometimes copied, hidden or read by moonlight. The books they weren't supposed to have. The words they were not meant to know. If you listen closely, in the hush of an old library, you can hear not only the rustle of pages but the held breath of a reader. Someone turning a leaf not just of paper, but of possibility. Tonight, we walk softly into the shadowed libraries of medieval convents. This is no place of dust and decay, but of quiet rebellion. Here, beneath carved beams and behind locked doors, nuns reached for knowledge not meant for them. And in ink, they found escape. Let us begin with Sister Helwisa, a scribe in the Abbey of Saint Radegonde, late 12th century. Her job was to copy scripture, line by line in Latin with careful flourishes, psalters, gospels, lives of the saints. But in the margins of one manuscript, she left something unexpected. A poem, not a hymn, not a lamentation, but a riddle in Old French about love. My name is never spoken aloud, yet lovers write me with trembling hands. What am I? The answer, we think, is desire. What was it doing there? Perhaps she meant it as a game. Or perhaps it was her way of marking the moment, a soft confession in ink. The rules were clear. Most convents followed strict reading lists. The Bible, of course, Augustine, Gregory, approved saints, some spiritual commentaries. But outside that, sacred circle lay books considered dangerous, either because they inspired doubt or stirred the heart too deeply. And yet, those books still found their way in. Ovid was a favorite smuggled guest. His Metamorphoses, with its tales of transformation, longing, and punishment, resonated deeply. In one convent in Flanders, a copy was discovered in the infirmary, hidden behind a wall tapestry. It was heavily annotated. One sister had written beside the story of Daphne and Apollo. He chases, she flees. But what if she stays? Then, there were the herbals, books on healing, on roots and salves, on women's medicine. Some were allowed if copied from monastic sources. But others, imported from Arabic scholars or older pagan traditions, were strictly forbidden. Too much talk of the body, too much agency. Yet convent infirmaries quietly thrived. Nuns learned to mix tonics, to set bones, to ease birth pains. They shared recipes for balms and teas. In some manuscripts, pressed petals remain, used as bookmarks between pages on fertility or sleep. These women knew what they were doing, and they kept it quiet. In the Abbey of Santa Maria in Burgos, a young nun named Teresa de la Rosa was discovered with a copy of The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, an ancient work of logic and sorrow, widely admired but not always approved for women. She claimed it was for penance. She read it every day. The abbess allowed it, then asked to borrow it. Books were not merely forbidden by title. Some were dangerous by subject. There are records of nuns reading about astrology, not to cast spells but to understand the heavens. One sister in Mainz wrote horoscopes for her fellow nuns. She called it mapping God's calendar. She was eventually told to stop. Even romance tales crept in. Manuscripts tell of stories passed like secrets, Tristan and Isolde, tales of knights and enchantresses, of women waiting in towers not unlike convents. The heroines always yearning, the endings always tragic. Perhaps that was the draw. One parchment fragment found in a convent in Provence contains a retelling of the Romance of the Rose, but rewritten from the woman's perspective. It ends not with surrender, but solitude. A choice. Who wrote it? We may never know. The Church did not always condemn such curiosity. Some abbots and confessors encouraged learning as long as it reinforced faith. But the line between knowing and doubting is thin. The more you read, the more you question. And some nuns began to ask, why this book and not that one? Why this truth and not the others? One anonymous sister, in a scribbled note found in the back of a theological text, wrote, "If God made my mind, why must I keep it quiet?" Sometimes books were destroyed. An abbess in Toulouse burned 7 volumes brought by a novice, works of secular history, legends, even a book of riddles. She wrote in her account, "The girl wept, but I saved her soul." Or perhaps, her soul had already been kindled. In one touching case, a dying nun asked that a certain book be buried with her. The book was the life of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, known for her wisdom, beauty, and her refusal to marry. The nuns honored the request. The grave record lists 1 veil, 1 cross, 1 book. The library of a convent was not always grand. Sometimes it was a cupboard, a shelf, a single chest. But the words inside those bindings were more than parchment and glue. They were prayers, they were windows, they were rebellion in syllables. One last image before we end tonight. A winter night. A single candle. A nun, perhaps 30, perhaps 70, sits in the scriptorium. Everyone else sleeps. She opens a book she's not supposed to have. She reads slowly, lips moving in silence. Her eyes shine, not with sin, not with heresy, but with recognition. In our next part, we'll explore how some nuns turned their words outward, becoming writers, letter writers, and even critics of the very institutions that cloistered them. When the veil lifts, and the pen writes back, the quill is lifted, the page is blank, the air is still, and then, softly, a line appears. Not scripture, not copied doctrine, but something new, personal, pointed, patient like snowfall. Tonight we sit beside the writing desk of the cloistered woman who will not remain voiceless. This is the chapter of the letter writers, the questioners, the thinkers in habits. In the quiet centuries of cloistered life where obedience and silence were the expected posture, there came women who chose to speak, Not loudly, not publicly, but with ink, and often with surprising eloquence. Let us begin with Eloise, of course. Though more commonly remembered for her ill-fated romance with the philosopher Abelard, her letters, written from her abbey at Argenteuil, are among the most intellectually daring and emotionally nuanced works. Of the 12th century, Heloise was not a nun by choice. Her entrance into religious life was arranged after her secret marriage was exposed and Abelard mutilated. Yet her letters, years later, are not bitter. They are brilliant. She questions God. She challenges Abelard's theology. She laments the physical longing that never quite left her soul. "I would rather be your mistress than the empress of the world," she wrote. "God knows, I never sought anything in you but yourself." These were not the words of a meek servant. They were the words of a scholar, philosopher, and woman of terrible clarity, and she was not alone. Hildegard of Bingen, whom we met briefly before, wrote more than visions. She sent letters, hundreds, to bishops, popes, even the emperor. She scolded them, warned them, advised them. One letter to a local bishop reads, "You are the shepherd of souls, yet you trample the garden. Repent and tend it." She was not ignored, nor was she punished, because her voice, even when sharp, came wrapped in sacred authority. But many nuns who wrote did not have Hildegard's fame or protection. One sister in Austria, Agnes of Kremsmünster, wrote a small tract challenging the interpretation of Eve's sin. She argued that Adam's failure to guide, not Eve's desire to know, was the true original fault. The manuscript survived only in fragments, hidden in the binding of another book. But her words remain. Was she punished for tasting, or for hungering to understand? Not all nuns were theologians, some were simply correspondents. But even these letters, simple, daily, often routine, carry undercurrents of insight. In the 14th century, Sister Columba of Bruges exchanged letters with her brother, a Benedictine monk. They debated the meaning of charity, the rules of Lent, and whether animals could possess gentle souls. His answers are dry, hers are lyrical. "If the lamb bleats with fear and I soothe it, have I not shown grace?" One of the most remarkable voices comes from a lesser-known English nun, Julian of Norwich, who, though technically an anchoress and not cloistered, lived a similarly enclosed life. Her Revelations of Divine Love is the first known book in English, written by a woman. It is bold. Julian presents a vision of God not as judge but as mother, not as fire but as warmth. Her most famous line, soft, unforgettable, is, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." She lived during plague, famine, and war, and still, she wrote of love. Other nuns used their pens more subtly. In a convent in France, 1431, a group of sisters began compiling a collection of humorous anecdotes, stories of daily life, and moral fables. It was not liturgical, it was not officially approved, but the abbess allowed it. One story tells of a novice who keeps hiding sweet bread during fast and finally dreams that St. Clare scolds her with a raised eyebrow. The story ends. She fasted ever after, except in dreams. These stories, passed between sisters, became a kind of internal culture, a way of saying, "We see each other. We live here not as shadows but as selves." There were, of course, those who tried to stop the pens, bishops who demanded the burning of personal journals, priests who warned that excessive writing led to pride. One abbess in Spain confiscated all parchment except that used for liturgical copying, but somehow, writing endured. One nun wrote her poems on fabric scraps, another etched them lightly into wax tablets. A third composed hymns so filled with longing they bordered on secular, until one clever sister reworded them into Latin and passed them off as ancient. The pen was not always rebellion. Often it was simply identity. In a world that denied women, pulpits, bookshelves, and titles, writing became a kind of spiritual breathing, a place to name things, to record what was felt, if not spoken, and sometimes to push back. In a surviving parchment from the mid-1300s, a nun wrote in tiny script at the bottom, I wrote this. I thought it. No one told me. And yet it may still be true. One last image tonight. A nun sits in a narrow cell. A candle flickers. The door is shut. Outside, silence. But inside, on the desk, on the page, in her hand, there is motion. There is ink. And in that ink, a voice the world was not meant to hear, but now cannot forget. In our next part, we step back into the realm of the body, not desire this time, but death. We will explore how nuns prepared for dying, how they viewed the afterlife, and how even in death, their secrets sometimes refuse to stay buried. The candle gutters, the last bell tolls, and somewhere in the quiet, a breath is exhaled and not drawn again. Tonight, we walk slowly into the final chamber of cloistered life. Not scandal, not sin, but the sacred stillness of death. In the medieval convent, death was not feared as an interruption, but welcomed as completion. A long vigil ended, a final vow fulfilled. And yet, as we shall see, death was also a moment when secrets surfaced. Some whispered, some left wordless. Let us begin with the ritual. When a nun died, her sisters gathered in prayer. The bell of the convent would toll once for each year she had lived. If she was elderly, the tolling could last all morning. If she was young, the sound was sharper, the loss more jarring. Her body was washed, gently by the hands of the women who had prayed beside her, gardened with her, perhaps even quarreled with her. Washed, clothed in a simple habit, and laid upon a bier in the chapel. They called it the transitus, the passing. The liturgy was solemn but tender. Psalms were sung, candles lit, and in some convents a sister would remain beside the body through the night, reading the book of Job or the Gospels in a low murmur. Not all deaths were peaceful. Some came suddenly, fevers, childbirth, plague. Others came slowly with months of fasting, illness, or spiritual withdrawal. There are stories of nuns who predicted their own deaths, claiming visions or signs. One, Sister Ghislaine of Tours, told her abbess that she had seen a white ladder descending from heaven 3 days before she died. Her sisters later carved a ladder on her gravestone, small, almost hidden. But perhaps most intriguing are the confessions made at the edge. In the final hours, when the veil between worlds thinned, some nuns spoke freely for the first time. They asked for letters to be burned, for names to be forgiven, for rooms to be searched. One dying sister in Poitiers in 1382 requested that the small wooden box beneath her bed not be opened until the third Mass after her soul had flown. Inside were poems and a child's carved toy. She had been in the convent since age 7. Not all secrets were so gentle. In the convent of San Luca in Florence, a nun on her deathbed admitted to an affair with a visiting cleric 20 years earlier. She named him. He was long dead. But her abbess noted it anyway in the convent log, writing, "She carried it in silence. May the Lord judge gently." Sometimes the secrets came not from the dying, but from those left behind. After a nun passed, her possessions were reviewed. Most had little, a comb, a book, a small crucifix, but occasionally something else. A hidden letter, a ring, a coin tucked in a hem. One convent in Wales reported finding a small bottle of perfume among the belongings of a departed sister. They were unsure whether to burn it, bury it, or keep it as relic. In the end, they placed it on the altar for one night only, then returned it to the earth. There was beauty in the burial. Nuns were not placed in grand tombs or gilded coffins. They were wrapped in woolen shrouds, placed in wooden coffins if funds allowed, and lowered into the convent cemetery. A simple cross, often unmarked, stood at the head. Yet some were remembered more deliberately. If a nun had been particularly holy or particularly beloved, her grave might be adorned with flowers or carvings. In some cases, her name was embroidered on the hem of her burial gown. One abbey recorded a sister buried with a lock of another nun's hair, wrapped in parchment that read, "She prayed with me when I could not." For all the solemnity, death was also a communal event. In the weeks following a passing, the convent entered a period of reflection. Some abbesses encouraged the sisters to write letters to the departed, notes of thanks, regret, or simple remembrance. These were placed in a basket and burned on All Souls' Day. One note preserved by chance reads, "You stole my comb. I forgave you, and I missed you every day you were sick." Laughter and grief, it seems, walk hand in hand. In rare cases, a nun's death became a subject of local wonder. Some were said to have died with smiles. Others were rumored to be surrounded by scents of roses or sounds of unseen bells. Whether miracle or myth, these moments were shared again and again, stories of grace and mystery. But there were darker tales. In a few convents, buried beneath scandal, are accounts of nuns who died in disgrace, excommunicated, unrepentant, or simply misunderstood. These women were often buried apart, sometimes even without prayer. Yet time, as it does, softened the memory. And in some cases, those once cast out were later commemorated with quiet masses, years after their passing. One final candle tonight. Imagine a small chapel at dusk. A single bier rests beneath the altar. A nun lies wrapped in linen, hands folded, her habit clean and worn. Her sisters chant softly. Outside, wind stirs the ivy. And perhaps, just before the last prayer, one sister reaches out and tucks a folded note into the shroud. Just a few words, unseen, unread, but carried into silence. In our next part, we rise again, not to sin, not to scandal, but to survival. We will explore how convents endured war, plague, political upheaval, and the slow decline of monastic life. How these women adapted, persisted, and sometimes quietly disappeared from history. The world does not wait for peace. Even behind the thickest walls, even beneath the most prayerful roof, the rumble of armies, the cough of plague, the smoke of reform, they arrive, they enter, and sometimes they do not leave. Tonight, we open the heavy gates not to visitors but to survival. How did cloistered women weather the chaos of history? How did the convent, so still, so ritual-bound, respond to a world that refused to stand still? Let us begin with war. The 100 Years' War between England and France raged for over a century. Cities were burned, fields ruined, taxes extracted, loyalties tested. And though nuns were not fighters, their lives were no less shaken. Normandy, the convent of Sainte-Cécile, was raided 3 times. The sisters fled, returned, fled again. Their cows were stolen, their orchard burned. The scriptorium, once filled with humming scribes, became a storehouse for grain, and yet they adapted. The abbess began writing letters, not to bishops, but to local barons, asking for protection in exchange for prayers. A small compromise. A necessary one, and it worked. In Germany, during the Hussite Wars, some convents fortified their walls, hiring guards. In one account from 1420, a group of sisters took refuge in a cellar for a month, living off stored onions and honey. One sister later wrote, "God heard us through stone and hunger. Then came plague. The Black Death swept through Europe like a wind of fire." Between 1347 and 1351, entire villages vanished, and convents, built on community and close contact, suffered terribly. At the Abbey of Saint-Marie in Avignon, over half the sisters died within weeks. The bells tolled until no one had strength to pull them. The survivors, too few to maintain full liturgy, simply sat in silence. For days. But again, they endured. New novices arrived, often girls orphaned by the plague. The abbess allowed leniencies. More food, less fasting. Some rules were relaxed. One chronicler noted, "God's mercy must flow through softened hands." In England, some convents were repurposed. Hospitals, shelters, almshouses. Nuns cared for the sick, knowing the cost. In Norwich, Sister Juliana of Holt died after tending to plague victims for 22 days without pause. Her final act? washing the feet of a coughing beggar. Then came the Reformation. In the 16th century, change did not whisper, it roared. Across northern Europe, Protestant reformers denounced monasteries as corrupt, indulgent, unnecessary. Convents were shuttered, lands seized, nuns evicted. Some were given pensions, others simply vanished, but not all bowed. In Flanders, Sister Marguerite wrote defiantly in her journal, "They closed our gates, but not our prayers." Her community continued meeting, in secret, disguised as seamstresses. They recited the Psalms beneath bolts of cloth. In England, under Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, over 200 convents were closed. Some nuns married, others fled abroad, joining continental houses in France, Spain, or the Low Countries. A few resisted. The Benedictine convent at Sion near London re-established itself in exile in France. For generations it existed as a shadow house, English nuns in foreign lands keeping alive the old liturgies. But even without enemies, convents faced a slower threat: time. By the 17th century, fewer women were joining. Cities were drawing them, with new roles: teachers, midwives, writers. The monastic life, once the default for unmarried daughters, became a choice. A rare one. Some convents merged, others downsized. A few reinvented themselves. In Italy, Ursuline sisters began focusing on education. They taught girls from noble and merchant families grammar, music, even basic mathematics. The classroom replaced the cloister. The voice became tool, not silence. In France, during the Revolution, convents were attacked not as sinful, but as symbols of monarchy and control. Archives were burned, habits torn. And yet, in the countryside, some nuns continued, wearing black dresses instead of robes, reciting prayers behind locked barn doors. Their persistence was quiet, but real. And even in moments of collapse, there was grace. In a Spanish convent destroyed by fire in the early 1700s, the only item recovered from the ashes was a wooden cross, charred but intact. The abbess had it mounted on the wall of their temporary shelter. Underneath, she wrote, "We are not stone, we are smoke, and smoke always rises." One might ask, why did they stay? Why did some women, facing plague, war, political ruin, choose to remain? The answer is not always faith. Sometimes it was habit, or loyalty, or love for the rhythm of cloistered life, for the sister who hummed at dawn, for the fig tree in the courtyard, for the silence that made room for something deeper, and, perhaps, for hope. Because even as buildings fell, as rules bent, as numbers dwindled, some convents remained, survived, transformed. One final scene tonight. A convent in rural Bavaria. The year is 1790. Only 4 sisters remain. They cannot afford candles. Their roof leaks. But each night they gather in the cold chapel. They sing, not in full harmony, but together their voices rise like mist, and somewhere on a creaking shelf a bell still waits to be rung. In our next part, we return to the personal, exploring what daily life truly looked like inside the convent. What did nuns eat, wear, do? How did they pray, work, wash, joke? The rhythm of the ordinary and the beauty it held. Before there was scandal, before visions, before escape or exaltation, there was simply the day, the morning, the light, the steps along cold flagstone, the clatter of bowls, the creak of wood, and the prayer whispered not with passion or pain, but with rhythm, habit, a slow choreography of the cloister. Tonight we drift into a single day, unremarkable, uneventful, and yet complete. Let us imagine Marjorie, a Benedictine nun in 13th century England. She is 51. Her knees ache. Her veil is patched but clean. And she has lived behind these walls since she was 13. The bell rings. Matins, the first office. stirs the dark. It is around 2:30 in the morning. The sisters rise from straw-stuffed mattresses. There is no time to wash, only to dress. The dormitory is cold. Slippers scuff. They move in silence to the chapel, candles flickering. Psalms are chanted. Latin murmured half from memory, half from effort. Domine, labia mea aperis. O Lord, open my lips. By the time lauds begins, the sky is graying. Marjorie returns briefly to her cell. She straightens her bed, checks her small crucifix, and runs a comb through her hair beneath the veil. Her fingers are stiff from sleep. She mutters something about old bones. God, she's sure, hears it kindly. Then comes chapter. The sisters gather, seated in order of seniority. The abbess reads a portion from the Rule of St. Benedict. Sometimes it's about humility, sometimes about labor. Today it is about silence. She looks gently at two novices who giggled the day before. They lower their eyes. Everyone smiles, just barely. After chapter, it's time for work. Marjorie is assigned to the herb garden this week. She checks the rosemary, the feverfew. The mint is spreading too far again. She takes a dull knife and begins trimming. She hums. No words, just a tuneless breath, half prayer, half habit. Nearby, another sister tends bees. Another is in the scriptorium, copying a hymn. Another is in the kitchen, turning barley with a wooden spoon as big as a child's arm. The tasks are many. Not glamorous, but necessary. The bell rings again. Terse. Back to chapel. Another psalm, a reading, then mass. The priest arrives, an old man with trembling hands. The sisters kneel. Some close their eyes. One dozes briefly. The abbess notices. Says, "Nothing after mass dinner, yes, dinner." The first full meal usually taken around 10:30 a.m. The refectory is long and bare. The sisters eat in silence while one reads aloud from a book, often scripture, sometimes the life of a saint. The food? Simple. Today, vegetable pottage, coarse, bread, a single pear. On feast days, they might get cheese. On Sundays, perhaps a bit of fish. Butter is rare. Meat forbidden unless for the sick. Still, Marjorie savors the warmth. She tucks the pear into her robe pocket. For later, she thinks. After dinner, recreation. This is not play, but rest. Some sisters nap, others mend robes. A few sit in the courtyard and sew. Marjorie joins them, kneeling on a cushion she's had since she was 20. The corners are frayed. She pretends not to notice. The talk is soft, permitted. They speak of the weather, of Sister Winifred's latest snore, of the new novice who walks too fast. Laughter, brief and quiet, rises like a bird and flutters down again. Then, none. More prayer. The sun now high, the air warm. Afternoon brings more labor. Marjorie helps in the kitchen, peeling onions. She cries, not from the sting, but because her thoughts drift to a letter received months ago. Her niece has married. Marjorie prays she is kind. She wipes her eyes, keeps peeling. Later, vespers. The shadows grow long. The chant deepens. There's a kind of sigh in the room, as though the whole convent is exhaling. Afterward, the evening meal. Much smaller than dinner. A bit of bread, a turnip, a small cup of watered wine. On feast days, broth. Then, Compline, the final prayer. The last light. The sisters file in once more, tired but settled. The chant is low. The abbess reads a blessing. And then, silence begins. The great silence, from nightfall to morning. Marjorie returns to her cell. She removes her veil, rubs her feet, prays with her fingers curled around the wooden cross beside her bed. She thinks of nothing profound, only, thank you for the turnip and the cushion, and perhaps that's enough. The convent, for all its strictness, was a place of routine. That routine was not prison, but rhythm, a slow tide, the same prayers, the same meals, the same shoes at the same door, and yet, no 2 days were truly alike. The birds changed song, the wind shifted, a sister fell ill, a letter arrived, a bell sounded wrong and made everyone smile for no reason. In the scriptorium, someone dropped an inkwell. In the orchard, a pear fell too early. And Marjorie? She hummed in the herb garden and tucked her pear in her pocket. One final moment before sleep. In her cell lit by fading amber, Marjorie writes in a little book, a list of herbs, a line from a psalm, and 3 words. Today was gentle. In our next part, we will explore how convents shaped their surroundings, how nuns influenced the towns around them, how they interacted with pilgrims, beggars, merchants, and the curious men who came to their gates, not always with prayer in their hearts. Not all who came to the convent sought God. Some brought grain, some brought gossip, some brought trouble. And though the walls were high, the gates thick, and the rules clear, the world found its way in. Tonight, we rest at the threshold, the place where the cloister touched the town, where silence met voices, where prayers were interrupted by hooves, laughter, bargains, and occasionally, temptation. Let us begin with the parlor, a small stone room near the entrance of many convents. It was not lavish, a bench, a grate, sometimes a wooden screen. This was where nuns could speak with outsiders, family, confessors, bishops, merchants. Voices, not faces. Words, not touch. Here, Sister Alex of Tournai received weekly visits from her cousin, a baker. He brought bread, updates, and stories of the town square. She brought prayers and gentle sarcasm. In a surviving letter, she wrote, "Tell Mother you sold the wheat dearer than your conscience. I will pray for your soul and your customers." These conversations, though brief, were a lifeline. Family brought news. Not always good. Births, deaths, wars, debts. Occasionally marriage proposals meant for the younger sisters, offers which had to be gently refused, even if the novice secretly blushed. Some visitors brought charity. The poor were not allowed inside the cloister, but they came to the gate. Nuns distributed bread, salves, and sometimes scraps of cloth. One convent in Aragon recorded giving 2 loaves, a shawl, and 3 prayers to a widow each week for a year. One day, the widow stopped coming. The sisters held a short mass for her. No one asked her name. Pilgrims came too. On their way, to Santiago or Canterbury or Rome, they stopped at convents for rest, for blessing, for a bowl of stew. The sisters rarely spoke with them, but they prepared the food, washed their linens, and listened from behind screens as the travelers sang strange songs in strange tongues. One nun kept a journal of phrases she overheard. Her favorite was from a Breton traveler. "All I seek is a bed, a bowl, and a blessing," in that order. But not all visitors were welcome. There were men who came too often, a merchant who lingered too long by the orchard wall, a young novice who laughed too freely at a mason's joke. The abbess, always watchful, would step in. "Walls are built of more than stone," she once said, and yet not all dangers came with desire. Merchants brought more than goods, they brought stories. A bolt of fabric came with the tale of a queen's scandal. A jar of honey carried rumors of excommunication. These tales filtered into the convent, changing the air. One nun in Poitiers wrote, "We live in silence, but the world hums through the baskets they pass us." And then, of course, came the gifts. Some were pious. Candles, altarpieces, books. Others, more curious. A nobleman once sent a lute to a convent in Florence for the instruction of holy song. The abbess returned it with a note. "Our voices suffice. Strings may lead astray." But not all rejected such offerings. One convent kept a pet deer, gifted by a grateful widow. It roamed the courtyard. The sisters named it Sebastian. They fed it figs. It lived 8 years and died during Compline. The Mass that evening included a special chant. Visitors also brought scandal. A bishop once arrived at a convent in Bohemia to investigate rumors of lax discipline. He stayed 2 days, left with a bottle of wine and no notes. A year later, the convent was burned, no cause recorded. But some said it was not fire from heaven. Still, the relationship between convent and town was rarely hostile. The sisters were not ghosts. They were neighbors, employers, healers, letter writers. They stitched vestments for priests, taught daughters of the wealthy, and prepared remedies for childbirth. The gate was not just boundary, it was bridge. There are accounts of feast days, where the townsfolk were invited, into the outer courtyard, not the cloister proper. There, children played. Bread was shared. Psalms were sung. Once, a traveling juggler performed. A nun laughed so loudly she dropped her rosary. It was retrieved. All was forgiven, and sometimes, love bloomed. A young novice in Normandy, age 17, fell in love with a boy who brought butter to the kitchen door. He wrote her a note. She never replied, but she kept the butter, tucked in cloth, and gave it to a sick sister. The note she burned, but she remembered in her diary. She later wrote, "The butter was salted but sweet in the gesture. One final moment tonight." At sunset, the convent gate closes. The sisters gather for Compline. The world grows quiet outside. A cart rolls past, a dog barks. The baker's boy sings a verse off key. Inside, Marjorie, yes, our old friend, places a bowl of stew by the gate. No one there yet, but someone will come, and she will not see them, but she will have fed them. In our next part, we will look at how convents portrayed themselves through art, embroidery, manuscripts, and architecture. The ways nuns told the world who they were, even without speaking aloud. They did not shout. They stitched. They carved. They painted in margins and built with light. And through these quiet gestures, nuns across centuries left behind voices, not in volume, but in beauty. Tonight, we walk slowly through the art of the cloister. Not grand frescoes or golden cathedrals, but the soft-lit world of embroidery, illumination, and stone that whispered, "We are here." Let us begin with the needle. In convents across Europe, embroidery was more than craft. It was theology, meditation, even defiance. With thread and linen, nuns told sacred stories in color and texture. At the convent of Wilton in 12th century England, sisters created altar cloths and vestments so intricate they were sought after by royalty. One surviving piece, the Alb of St. Edith, contains scenes not just of saints but of animals, vines, and even a nun holding a needle as large as her arm. Was that self-portrait? Perhaps. Embroidery offered freedom within rules. The abbess might choose the subject, Christ the Virgin, the life of a martyr, but the details, the flourishes, the quiet jokes stitched into a lamb's expression or a dragon's tongue, those were left to the needlewoman. One cloth from Flanders includes a tiny figure in the corner, barely visible, of a nun chasing a chicken. Scholars call it an error. Others call it wit. And then, the books. We've spoken before of scribes, but tonight we look at the illuminators, nuns who painted in miniature. Imagine the scene: a long wooden desk, a pot of gold leaf, tiny brushes made from squirrel hair. A sister leans close, tongue between teeth, as she paints the halo of St. Agnes. In the convent of Unterlinden, 14th century, the sisters produced a book of hours with margins filled not just with angels, but with women baking bread, combing hair, and curiously a nun winking. These details were not distractions, they were declarations. In a world where women were silenced, these images said, "We see, we live, we remember." Some illuminations defied more than invisibility. In one Italian manuscript, a scene of the Annunciation includes a female angel. In another, a tiny banner reads, "Feci me," I made myself. A quiet assertion of authorship. Even in silence, the pen had pride. Now, to stone convent architecture may seem plain compared to cathedrals, but look closer. The layout of cloisters, square, harmonious with a garden at the center, was itself a statement. Order within enclosure, Eden reclaimed. In the Abbey of Fontevraud, the chapter house is decorated with carved capitals that depict not only biblical scenes but daily life. Nuns teaching children, tending bees, even a scene of three sisters dancing in a ring. Did they dance? Likely not often, but someone wanted it carved. Wanted joy recorded. And in windows, glass told stories. A single panel from a convent in Burgundy shows Saint Cecilia with a harp. Her eyes are closed. Below her, a sister kneels listening. Not looking. Listening. Perhaps this was how the artist saw herself, not the saint but the one who received the music. In some chapels, nuns designed their own choir stalls, complete with carvings of flowers, fruit, birds. Each sister sat in the same seat each day. The carving beneath her might have been chosen. A personal emblem. One stall shows a fox in a cassock. Another, a swan. Another, a snail holding a candle. And on the walls, frescoes bloomed. In the convent of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, soft painted scenes of the Virgin Mary include details absent from church doctrine. A child's toy at Mary's feet, a woman weaving behind her, doves nesting in the beams. These were not mistakes. These were memory, the lives of women made sacred, and sometimes a bit of rebellion. In a convent in Spain, a fresco of St. George slaying the dragon shows faintly in the background a second woman, far from the traditional damsel. She holds a spear. She is laughing. No one ever identified the painter. But the abbess did not paint over it. Art in the cloister was not simply devotional. It was communal. Sisters worked together, passing fabric, holding lanterns, mixing pigment, debating shades of blue, and sometimes they left traces. On the back of one painted panel in Cologne, there's a list of names, nuns who worked on it. Below the names, a line, done with gladness and tired eyes. One final image tonight. A chapel lit by morning sun. The windows glow blue and gold. A nun kneels before a carved altar. She does not speak. But behind her, the walls bloom with saints and symbols, some familiar, some strange. A rabbit holds a key. A cat sleeps beneath the Virgin's robe. A tree grows, half real, half imagined. She kneels in silence. But around her, the art sings. In our next part, we will explore the end of this long tradition, the decline of medieval monasticism, the fading of the cloister, and how the memory of these nuns lived on, or vanished into the stones. Every bell must quiet. Every song, however long, will end. Tonight we listen not to scandal or laughter or whispered visions, but to the soft hush of a world fading. The slow, gentle decline of the medieval convent, not in fire, not in violence, but in silence. By the late 17th and into the 18th century, the age of monastic flourishing, the time of illuminated manuscripts, embroidered vestments, and choir stalls humming with morning psalms, was quietly coming to a close. Let us begin with the numbers. Where once hundreds of convents dotted the landscape of Europe, now there were dozens. Where once communities numbered 50 or 60 sisters, now they shrank to 5, 6, sometimes just 2. In a convent near Ghent, by 1724, the last 3 sisters sat in a chapel whose roof leaked and whose organ had been silent for a decade. The abbess, too old to write, dictated the final entry in the convent register. We are not lost, we are finished. What happened? The causes were many. The Reformation, centuries earlier, had already swept away hundreds of houses in northern Europe. Monasteries were dissolved, lands seized, nuns returned to families or scattered to other orders. In some places, such as England, the very idea of cloistered life became associated with superstition or corruption. But even in Catholic countries, change came. Enlightenment thinkers questioned monasticism. Governments began to view cloisters as economically unproductive. The once respected abbess became, to some eyes, an unnecessary figurehead. In France, during the Revolution, convents were nationalized. Some became prisons, others schools. Many were stripped of relics, books burned or sold. The nuns were expelled, given pensions, or simply turned out. Yet some resisted. In secret they gathered, wore black, prayed softly, in homes, in cellars, in forests. The rhythm continued, but faintly. Others adapted. Some orders redefined their roles: teaching, nursing, orphan care. The enclosure rule relaxed. The veil opened, just a little. In Spain, some convents reinvented themselves as places of education for girls. The psalms were sung still, but followed by grammar lessons. The sound of Latin gave way to laughter and recitation. But much was lost. The artistry faded. Few sisters learned to paint manuscripts or compose chants. The scriptoriums were shuttered. Embroidery gave way to mending. The great gardens were sold or paved, and with the decline of community came the loss of memory. So many names: Sister Hiltrude, Sister Agnes, Sister Isabel, written only once in a ledger, and never again. No grave, no song, just silence, yet not everything vanished. In the walls, echoes remained. A convent in Portugal, turned into a museum, kept its old refectory. Visitors today can still see the painted tiles, the sisters' own handiwork, depicting not saints, but vines and birds and stars. No names. But the brushstrokes speak. In a church in Italy, a small chapel once used by nuns now serves as storage. But one day, a historian cleaning the walls found a faint inscription scratched into plaster. "We sang here." Just that. 4 words. Enough. Some stories lived on in folk memory. In a village in the Pyrenees, elders still tell of a nun who healed with her hands and cried when the rain came. No documents, no date, but someone remembered her. In Ireland, songs survive. Fragments said, "To be from a cloistered poetess." The lyrics are simple: grief, sea, a longing for home. Perhaps imagined, perhaps real, and in some places, the sisters remained. One convent in rural Poland never closed. The community shrank, yes, but they sang daily. One old nun, well into her 90s, was asked why she stayed. She answered, "Because no one stopped me." There is something beautiful in that. The convent did not explode. It exhaled. It folded its linens. It dimmed its candles. It sang its last psalm a little slower each time. One final image tonight: an old chapel, no longer in use. Dust on the pews, the altar bare, but in a far corner, a small wooden bench, a single cushion flattened by years, and on the wall behind it, carved in careful hand: Sister Marjorie sat here. Just that. No titles, no tales, but perhaps that's enough. In our next part, we will turn from history to legacy, exploring how the modern world remembers medieval nuns, what stories we tell, and how popular culture has reshaped, reclaimed, or romanticized their lives. The veil falls. The candle goes out. And yet, the story lingers. Tonight, we walk not in the shadow of cloisters, but through libraries, films, museum halls, and dusty novels. We explore not the lives medieval nuns lived, but the ones we remembered, or thought we did. For even as the real convents faded, the image of the medieval nun never truly disappeared. It transformed. Let us begin with history books. Serious, weighty tomes, full of footnotes, timelines, and Latin quotes. For centuries, they spoke mostly of abbots and kings. Nuns appeared briefly, as footnotes, as exceptions, as passive figures. But that began to change. In the 20th century, historians, especially women, started looking again. They dug into convent records, personal letters, fragments of embroidery. What they found was not silence, but voice. Not passivity, but presence. Books like Women in the Middle Ages by Regine Pernoud or Holy Feast and Holy Fast by Caroline Bynum revealed whole worlds of female spirituality, labor, and expression. Suddenly, Sister Agnes wasn't just a name, she was a writer, a healer, a human. And yet, even as academia recovered real lives, popular culture did something else. On the stage and screen, the nun became a figure, comic, tragic, romantic, sometimes all at once. In the musical The Sound of Music, Maria twirls in meadows, rebels joyfully, and wins the heart of a brooding captain. Her fellow nuns fret and sing. It's a sweet story, based loosely on real events, but far from cloistered reality. And in comedies like Sister Act, the convent becomes a place of transformation. Rigid turned joyful, silence turned soul music. The nun becomes not a contemplative, but a vehicle for change. Even in drama, the image persists. Films set in the Middle Ages often show nuns as tragic heroines, women locked away against their will, dreaming of freedom or tortured by guilt. Or they are portrayed as cold, stern, whispering secrets by candlelight. Rarely are they allowed to be ordinary. The actual rhythms of cloistered life, its slowness, its quiet joys, its human awkwardness, are difficult to capture. Too still for cinema, too subtle for fiction. And yet, some creators try. In recent years, novels like Matrix by Lauren Groff have reimagined the medieval nun as visionary leader. The story is fiction, yes, but rooted in historical possibility, a world of feminine agency within sacred walls. Art, too, has played with the image. Photographers stage women in veils against modern backdrops. Artists paint nuns with neon halos or surreal expressions. The contrast speaks of the past imagined, of faith refracted through today's lens. Even memes have found the nun. On social media, images of stern sisters with wooden rulers abound, often captioned with jokes about discipline, guilt, or unexpected sass. It's absurd, it's affectionate, but it shows one thing clearly. The medieval nun is still with us. But what of pilgrimage? Some modern travelers visit former convents, now museums, guest houses, ruins. They walk the cloisters, they touch the stone. They ask, what was it like? And sometimes, if they arrive at the right hour, they may hear a chant still sung, for some convents remain. In Benedictine or Carmelite houses across Europe, women still rise for matins, still work the gardens, still pray. Not medieval, but not lost either. And among them are scholars, artists, musicians, keeping threads alive. One abbey in France hosts a workshop on manuscript illumination. Another in Spain offers herbal medicine, courses based on 14th century texts. And a convent in Italy hosts online vespers via livestream, chanting Latin psalms into the digital ether, a strange harmony, ancient breath, modern airwaves. Even in fashion, the silhouette of the habit appears. Designers borrow its stark lines, its mystery, not always with understanding, but with fascination. And why? Because there is something hauntingly powerful about the image of a woman cloaked, veiled, silent, but watching. She represents discipline, repression, freedom, escape, all at once. But perhaps most of all, she represents a mystery we keep circling. What happens when a woman removes herself from the world? Not out of fear, but of purpose. One final thought tonight. In a museum in Vienna, there is a small embroidered cloth. It is faded, frayed, no label, but under glass it reads, Work of Sister Magdalena, c. 1290. No story, no context. But look closer. The thread curves into a bird, its wings outstretched, not flying, but poised. Perhaps that is how we remember them, not in flight, but ready to rise. In our final part, we will return to the beginning, revisit the quiet scandal, the carnal whisper, the cloistered heartbeat, and offer a soft farewell to the world of medieval nuns with one last story, slow and deep as sleep. So we return, not to scandal, not to fire or vision or song, but to a room. Small, still, lit by late sunlight. A stone cell, a single window, a cushion, worn, and a woman kneeling. Not young, not old, only silent. Her hands folded, her lips unmoving, her eyes closed. She could be praying, or simply breathing. This, at the end of it all, is the image we leave you with. Over 21 parts, we have wandered across centuries. We have peeked through lattices and pressed our ears to wooden grates. We have heard laughter, moans, chants, scribbled arguments, delicate threads pulled taut between heaven and earth. We have met saints, sinners, women who trembled with longing, and women who refused to tremble at all. We have opened the convent gates, not to expose, but to witness. Not to judge, but to understand. Tonight, as we close them again, let us look back. Remember Sister Heloise, whose letters still burn with longing centuries later. Remember Julian of Norwich, writing in a time of plague that all shall be well. Remember the anonymous nun who wrote in a margin, "I wrote this, I thought it, no one told me, and yet it may still be true." Remember Marjorie, our imagined friend, who hummed while trimming rosemary and tucked pears in her pocket. She did not change history, but she lived and prayed and smiled when someone dropped a spoon. And in remembering her, we remember the many. The girl sent to the convent at age 6. The woman who chose the veil at 40. The sister who confessed a secret on her deathbed. The one who painted doves in gold, even as her eyesight faded. The nun who never spoke but always listened. We began this journey with a whisper, the carnal scandals of medieval nuns, and more. Yes, there was scandal, desire, secret births, hidden lovers, confessions in the dark. But more than scandal, there was texture, routine, resistance, humor, devotion, fallibility, grace. These women were not angels, not symbols. They were human, in every soft, sharp, aching, beautiful shade that word allows. The cloister was not a cage. It was a canvas. Some painted with words, some with thread, some with silence. And like all canvases, it faded. The paint cracked, the edges frayed, the frame forgotten, but the image remains in our memory, in the margins of old books, in the sound of bells we no longer hear, but somehow still recall. One final story. In a convent now long gone, a novice was once asked what she missed most from her life outside. She answered, "The stars." The abbess, without a word, led her to the courtyard that night. The sky was clear, cold, the stars bright. They stood silent for a long time. Then the abbess said, "We have stars here too. You only have to remember to look up. Let that be our ending. May you find your stars, in old pages, in quiet rooms, in unexpected laughter, in the gentle rhythm of a world slower than ours, but not lesser. Thank you for walking this path with me. Sleep well."